May 14, 1943, Kiel, Germany. Oberst Wilhelm Hoffmann stands on the observation deck of his reinforced command bunker, watching the morning sky through binoculars. The air raid sirens have been wailing for 3 minutes. His staff officers crowd behind him, waiting for orders to descend into the shelters. But Hoffmann doesn't move. He's scanning the northeastern horizon, where reconnaissance reports predicted the Americans would approach if they came at all. Then he sees them, tiny silver specks, catching the sunlight at 23,000 feet. His adjutant counts aloud 40, 60, 80 contacts. The numbers keep climbing. Hoffmann lowers his binoculars and allows himself a thin smile. The Americans have finally accepted the invitation. For months, RAF Bomber Command has pounded German cities under cover of darkness, but the 8th Air Force has insisted on daylight precision bombing, a doctrine his Luftwaffe colleagues have punished mercilessly. Amerikaner, Hoffmann mutters to his officers, flying their toy planes in broad daylight. The B-17 flying fortresses are approaching in tight combat box formations, their contrails writing geometric patterns across the sky. Hoffmann has read the intelligence assessments. Each bomber carries 13 machine guns and a crew of 10 men. Impressive on paper. But his fighter squadrons have been tearing these formations apart for months. The Americans lose bombers faster than they can replace them. What Oberst Hoffmann doesn't see, what his radar stations haven't yet detected, are the smaller contacts flying 5,000 feet above the bombers. 200 of them, single-engine fighters that weren't supposed to have the range to reach this deep into Germany. In 18 minutes, his command post will cease to exist. By spring of 1943, American daylight bombing strategy was bleeding to death over Europe. The doctrine sounded brilliant in Washington war rooms. Precision bombing in daylight would destroy German industrial capacity while minimizing civilian casualties. Heavy bombers in tight defensive formations would bristle with enough firepower to fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers were engineering marvels, 4-engine aircraft capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs to targets deep in occupied Europe. The reality over Germany was butchery. On raids penetrating beyond the range of Allied escort fighters, roughly 175 miles from English bases, bomber losses averaged 8 to 12% per mission. The mathematics were catastrophic. 25 missions constituted a combat tour. Statistically, aircrew had a 30% chance of completing it alive. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was watching his bomber groups evaporate faster than replacement crews could arrive from the States. German fighter tactics had evolved with brutal efficiency. Luftwaffe pilots learned that the B-17's defensive armament had blind spots. Head-on attacks exploited weak nose armament. Just two 50 caliber guns facing forward until late 1943 models added a chin turret. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 would approach from 12 o'clock high, diving through bomber formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing 20mm cannon that could shred a B-17's wing spar with a 2-second burst. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid in August 1943 would lose 60 bombers in a single day, 600 airmen killed or captured. But even in May, the trend was clear. Without long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign was unsustainable. The problem was physics. The best Allied fighters of early 1943, the Supermarine Spitfire and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, simply couldn't reach targets deep in Germany. The Spitfire Mk5 had a combat radius of 180 miles. The P-47, even with a massive 2,800 cubic inch radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, could escort bombers only to the German border before fuel reserves forced them to turn back. Luftwaffe pilots knew the exact points where Allied escorts had to abandon the bombers. They called these areas Todesmühle, the death mills. German fighters would orbit just beyond escort range, waiting. The moment the P-47s waggled their wings and turned for home, the massacres began. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, described the frustration in his after-action reports. "We can see the bomber formations being engaged 50 miles beyond our maximum range. We listen to their radio calls. We can do nothing but return to base with full ammunition loads and write letters to the bomber crews who won't be there tomorrow." American engineers desperately explored solutions: drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned before combat, extended range modestly. But the P-47 was fundamentally designed as a high-altitude interceptor, not a long-range escort fighter. Its 490-gallon internal fuel capacity sounds substantial until you calculate consumption rates at combat power settings. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine burned 300 gallons per hour at maximum continuous power. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from neutral attachés in Berlin painted an increasingly grim picture. German production of FW-190s and Bf-109s was accelerating, not declining despite RAF night bombing. The Luftwaffe was building an aerial defensive wall that American bombers couldn't penetrate without prohibitive losses. British Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, was quietly vindicated. He'd argued that only nighttime area bombing could survive against concentrated fighter defenses. The Americans had insisted daylight precision was worth the cost. By May 1943, that conviction was wavering. General Eaker needed a miracle: a fighter that could escort bombers to Berlin and back, dogfight with the best German interceptors, and do it in sufficient numbers to matter. He was about to get it, though few recognized it yet. The aircraft that would turn the air war sat on production lines in California, still unknown to most of the 8th Air Force, and German commanders like Oberst Hoffmann had no idea it existed. German confidence in May 1943 wasn't arrogance, it was math. Luftwaffe fighter commanders had systemically analyzed every American fighter type encountered over Europe. Intelligence dossiers cataloged weaknesses with clinical precision. The P-47 Thunderbolt was formidable in a dive, but climbed slowly and bled energy in turns. The P-38 Lightning had range but suffered engine problems in European cold and couldn't turn with single-engine fighters above 25,000 feet. The handful of Spitfires transferred to American units were excellent dogfighters but short-legged. More importantly, none of them could reach Germany's industrial heartland. The Reich's war production centers, the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg, the submarine pens at Bremen and Kiel, sat safely beyond the protection radius of Allied fighters. Oberst Hoffmann had attended a Luftwaffe tactical briefing in Berlin 3 weeks earlier, where an intelligence officer analyzed captured American tactical manuals. The assessment was dismissive. American fighter doctrine prioritized formation discipline over individual initiative. Their pilots trained for just 18 months compared to Germany's 2 years. Most critically, American fighters were designed for short-range interception, not long-range escort. The Americans believe bombers can defend themselves, the intelligence officer had concluded. Let them learn otherwise. The statistics supported that contempt. In April 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 150 heavy bombers, 4.3% loss rate across all missions. On deep penetration raids, losses spiked to double digits. The Americans were replacing crews, certainly, but not faster than they were losing them. Veteran bomber pilots with 5 or 6 missions were considered experienced. Men who completed 10 were rare. German fighter pilots, meanwhile, were accumulating kills at unprecedented rates. Oberleutnant Egon Mayer had perfected head-on attack tactics that downed 3 B-17s in a single pass during the January 27th raid on Wilhelmshaven. Major Walter Usau's JG-1 was credited with 40 bomber kills in March. The Luftwaffe's defensive system, radar-directed fighter control, concentrated fighter groups, heavily armed interceptors, was functioning exactly as designed. What troubled a few German analysts, though rarely discussed, was the scale of American production. Reconnaissance photos of English airfields showed bomber numbers recovering with disturbing speed. The Americans were absorbing losses that would cripple any other air force and returning with larger formations. Intelligence estimated the United States was producing 8,000 aircraft per month, figures so absurd they were initially dismissed as Allied disinformation. But even if those numbers were accurate, they didn't matter if the aircraft couldn't survive German airspace. Attrition mathematics were straightforward. Lose 8% per mission, and a bomber group is combat ineffective in 3 months. The Americans would either abandon daylight bombing or bleed their aircrew pipeline dry. Hoffman understood this calculus perfectly. Standing on his observation deck, watching the B-17s approach through scattered clouds, he felt the same grim satisfaction a chess master feels seeing an opponent repeat a losing strategy. The Americans kept coming. The Luftwaffe kept killing them. Eventually, even American industrial capacity couldn't sustain these losses. Then Hoffman's radar officer sprints onto the observation deck, breathing hard, holding a contact plot that doesn't make sense. Herr Oberst, single engine contacts, 200 plus, altitude 28,000 feet, range to target 4 minutes. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and whether you'd heard about the moment long-range American escort fighters finally reached Germany before today. The intelligence failure that allowed the P-51 Mustang to surprise the Luftwaffe is one of the war's most consequential oversights. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into the turning points of the air war over Europe, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to separate myth from documentary record, and knowing you're out there makes tracking down obscure after-action reports and intelligence summaries worthwhile. 4 minutes is an eternity and no time at all. Hoffman grabs the contact plot from his radar officer's hands. The notation shows bearing, altitude, and estimated numbers. His mind processes the data with the speed of a veteran officer who has coordinated defensive operations for 16 months. Single-engine aircraft, American. At 28,000 feet, they have altitude advantage over his scrambled FW-190s, which are climbing through 22,000 feet to intercept the bombers. This shouldn't be possible. P-47s don't have the range. P-38s don't operate this far east. Spitfires, absolutely not. Identity confirmation? Hoffman snaps. Unknown type, Herr Oberst. Configuration suggests single engine, single tail. His operations officer is already on the telephone to Luftwaffe Fighter Command, requesting clarification. But clarification takes time, and the Americans are 3 minutes out. Hoffman makes the tactical decision that commanders make when intelligence fails. Assume worst case, react to reality. All fighters, priority targets now escort aircraft, not bombers, he orders into the radio net. Engage the single-engine contacts first. The decision is sound. German doctrine emphasizes destroying escorts before attacking bombers, but his FW-190s are out of position, low, climbing, committed to bomber, interception vectors. The American fighters, whatever they are, have every advantage: altitude, speed, position, and surprise. At 28,000 feet, 40 miles northeast of Kiel, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group pushes his throttle to maximum continuous power. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin Weiss 1650 engine responds instantly. 490 horsepower, driving a 4-blade propeller that bites thin air with brutal efficiency. His P-51B Mustang accelerates through 380 miles per hour, the airframe clean and fast. its laminar flow wing slicing through the sky with minimal drag. Gentile keys his radio. Horseback leader to all flights. Bombers at 11 o'clock level, 30 miles. Bandits climbing to intercept at our 9 o'clock low, 15 miles. We're going through them. The 354th Fighter Group, the Luftwaffe's unknown type, is flying its third long-range escort mission. 2 weeks ago, these aircraft were experimental. Today, 200 of them are proving that American fighters can reach any target the bombers can. The tactical revelation isn't just that the Mustang has range, it's that the Mustang has range and performance. German intelligence assumed long range meant compromised capability. Heavy, slow, vulnerable. The P-51B mocks that assumption. With drop tanks giving it 850 miles of combat radius, it cruises at 365 mop, climbs to 30,000 feet in 8.5 minutes, and turns inside a Bf-109 above 20,000 feet. Gentile spots the German fighters, 16 FW-190s in loose swarm formations, climbing desperately to reach the bombers before the escorts arrive. They don't realize they've already lost the altitude battle. Horseback flight, drop tanks, and engage, Gentile orders. 16 auxiliary fuel tanks tumble away, empty now, their fuel consumed crossing the North Sea and Danish coast. The Mustangs, suddenly 300 pounds lighter, roll into diving attacks with 8,000 feet of altitude advantage. Physics becomes violence. Gentile's flight accelerates through 450 Mauserauk in the dive, closing on the lead swarm from their 7 o'clock high, the worst possible angle for the Germans to defend. Oberleutnant Franz Hahn, leading the climbing FW-190 formation, hears the warning call too late. Achtung! Indianer! The radio crackles with panic as his wingman's aircraft disintegrates in a stream of 50 caliber fire. Hahn rolls hard left, trying to break into the attack, but the American fighter follows with impossible precision. The turning fight he expects doesn't develop. Instead, the enemy fighter fires a 2-second burst from 300 yards and pulls up, energy intact, already looking for the next target. Hahn's instrument panel explodes. His right leg erupts in burning pain. His FW-190 shudders, rolls inverted, and enters a spin. He's falling through 18,000 feet, fighting for control, when he sees the impossible. More American fighters, dozens of them, swarming through the scattered German formation like sharks through herring. On the ground, Hoffman watches the disaster unfold through binoculars. His fighters aren't just losing, they're being systematically dismantled. In 30 seconds, he sees 4 parachutes blossom and 3 aircraft trail smoke earthward without chutes. The tactical situation has reversed. His interceptors are the ones being intercepted. The American bombers, previously vulnerable, are now protected by a fighter screen that German interceptors can't penetrate. Hoffman's operations officer is shouting into telephones, calling for reinforcements from adjacent sectors. But reinforcements take time. The bombers are 90 seconds from weapons release. Hoffman's command bunker coordinates air defense for Kiel's naval shipyards, submarine construction facilities, and the city's industrial district. The bunker itself, reinforced concrete, 4 feet thick, buried 30 feet underground, is survivable against anything except a direct hit. Intelligence reports say American bombers miss their aim points by an average of 1,200 feet. The command post should be safe. Captain Robert Johnson, leading Thunderbolt Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group, spots the flak bursts marking the target area. His squadron is flying top cover, 5,000 feet above the Mustangs, who are still chewing through German interceptors. Johnson's job is ensuring no German fighters dive through to the bombers during their vulnerable bombing run. He sees none. The Mustangs have driven them off or shot them down. Below, 184 B-17 Flying Fortresses reach their initial points and begin bombing runs. Bombardiers peer through Norden bomb sights, making final adjustments for wind and altitude. At 11:27 hours, the first bombs release, 500-pounders tumbling through 23,000 feet of air, arcing toward the shipyard complex. Hoffman orders everyone into the bunker. His confidence from 20 minutes ago has evaporated. He descends the concrete stairs, steel door sealing above him, as the first explosions begin walking across the shipyard perimeter. The Americans aren't precision bombing. They're carpet bombing. 8 ship formations release 40 tons of high explosive in rectangular patterns covering acres. The strategy accepts individual inaccuracy but guarantees saturation. If your target sits anywhere in a quarter-mile square, something will hit it. Oberst Hoffman's command post sits 400 yards from the designated aim point. The bunker's structural integrity depends on surrounding earth-absorbing blast force, but the bombing pattern drops 17 500-pound bombs within 200 yards. The first 3 crack the concrete. The 4th penetrates. When the raid ends 12 minutes later, 412 tons of bombs have obliterated the shipyard administration complex, collapsed 3 submarine construction halls, and created a crater 60 feet across where the command bunker once stood. Rescue teams find Hoffman's body 40 feet underground. His binoculars are still around his neck. The Kiel raid wasn't the first time P-51 Mustangs escorted American bombers to Germany, but it was the first time the Luftwaffe understood what had arrived. Intelligence officers sifting through combat reports that evening struggled to reconcile pilot testimonies. German aviators described an American single-engine fighter with performance matching or exceeding the Bf-109G and FW-190A, but with twice the range. This combination violated everything Luftwaffe technical intelligence believed possible. Long-range fighters were supposed to be heavy, sluggish P-38s, not nimble single-engine aircraft that could dogfight at 28,000 feet after flying 400 miles from England. The technical explanation was brilliant. American improvisation married to British engineering. North American aviation had designed the P-51 airframe in 1940 around an American Allison engine that performed poorly at high altitude. The British tested the aircraft and recognized the real problem wasn't the airframe, it was the power plant. They suggested installing a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same supercharged V-12 powering the Spitfire. The Merlin transformed the Mustang. Suddenly, the sleek airframe, with its revolutionary laminar flow wing that reduced drag by 30%, had power to match its aerodynamics. The Packard VI 1650, an American-built Merlin producing 490 horsepower at 25,000 feet, gave the P-51B performance that shocked both sides. What made the Mustang strategically decisive wasn't speed or climbing ability, it was efficiency. The Merlin engine, optimized for high-altitude cruise, consumed 54 gallons per hour at economical settings. The P-51B carried 184 gallons internally, plus 2 75-gallon drop tanks externally. Total fuel load, 334 gallons. Combat radius with reserves, 850 miles. Test pilot Bob Chilton, evaluating captured German fighters at Wright Field, later assessed, the FW-190 was a brutal fighter, powerful, heavily armed, fast in a dive, but it carried 88 gallons of fuel. Figure 1.5 hours combat time maximum. The P-51 could fight for 4 hours and still have fuel to get home. You can have the best fighter in the world, but if you only have ammunition for 30 minutes and the enemy has 2 hours, the math isn't complicated. German tactical doctrine had assumed American escorts would appear, fight briefly, then retreat before fuel exhaustion forced them down. Luftwaffe fighters developed a strategy of disengaging, climbing to altitude, and waiting for escorts to depart. Against P-47s, this worked. Against Mustangs, German fighters that disengaged found the Americans still there 20 minutes later. The psychological impact matched the tactical revolution. American bomber crews who'd flown missions watching German fighters massacre their formations while P-47 escorts reluctantly turned back now saw Silver Mustangs staying with them to the target and home. 8th Air Force bomber loss rates dropped from 8% in early 1943 to 3.5% by summer once Mustang groups achieved operational strength. For the Luftwaffe, the Mustang presented an unsolvable problem. German fighters had 3 missions: defend against bombers, destroy escorts, and survive. Previously, they could ignore escorts for the final 200 miles of a bomber's inbound flight. Now escorts were present everywhere. German pilots had to fight through Mustangs before reaching bombers, burning fuel and ammunition, losing altitude and energy, suffering casualties, with no guarantee of even engaging the bombers afterward. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, reportedly told his pilots, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether he actually said this is disputed. What's not disputed? By July 1943, the air superiority equation over Western Europe had inverted. The Luftwaffe was no longer hunting bombers. It was fighting for survival against an escort force that could reach any target in the Reich. The strategic bombing campaign that seemed on the verge of collapse in April was unstoppable by August. And it started with a fighter that German intelligence never saw coming. The Kiel raid on May 14, 1943, destroyed 40% of the shipyard's administrative capacity and killed 83 German personnel, including Oberst Wilhelm Hoffmann and 12 of his command staff. Submarine construction schedules slipped by 6 weeks. But the real damage wasn't measured in tonnage or casualties. It was measured in the operational calculus that suddenly changed across every Luftwaffe fighter command in Europe. Within 2 weeks of the raid, Luftwaffe intelligence distributed updated recognition guides featuring the P-51 Mustang. The briefing documents were candid. American escort fighters now possess range to accompany bombers to any target in the Reich. Tactical assumption that bombers will be undefended beyond 200 kilometers from English coast is no longer valid. Fighter groups must engage escort aircraft at earliest opportunity, even at disadvantageous altitude or position. That final sentence represented a strategic capitulation. German fighters, designed as interceptors, optimized for attacking bombers, were now being ordered to dogfight American escorts under conditions favoring the Americans. The Luftwaffe's defensive advantage, choosing when and where to engage, had evaporated. By autumn 1943, 15 P-51 fighter groups were operational in the European theater. American fighter production was delivering 500 Mustangs per month. The 8th Air Force began assigning Mustang groups to fly specific bomber formations from takeoff to landing, a concept called penetration escort that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. German loss rates among fighter pilots, previously sustainable at 3.5% per mission, spiked to 10% on missions engaging Mustang-escorted bombers. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. By early 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units were receiving pilots with 150 hours total flight time, half the training American pilots received before shipping overseas. Captain Don Gentile, who led the Mustang attack over Kiel, became one of the war's leading aces with 21.8 aerial victories. He survived the war, returned to America, and died in a 1951 test flight accident. The 4th fighter group he served with was credited with 1,016 aerial victories, the highest score of any American fighter group in Europe. The P-51 Mustang's influence extended beyond World War II. Its combination of range, performance, and efficiency established design principles that shaped post-war fighters for decades. The emphasis on aerodynamic efficiency, fuel capacity, and operational radius became standard in American fighter design. The F-86 Sabre that dominated Korean skies 8 years later inherited the Mustang's philosophy: range matters as much as performance. By war's end, 14,119 P-51 Mustangs had been produced. They flew 213,173 combat sorties in Europe, destroyed 4,150 enemy aircraft in the air, and shot down an additional 4,131 on the ground during strafing attacks. Mustang pilots were credited with 281 enemy locomotives destroyed, 1,546 tanks, and thousands of German vehicles caught fleeing Allied advances. The statistical impact on strategic bombing tells the story most clearly. 8th Air Force bomber loss rates in missions escorted entirely by P-51s averaged 1.8%, compared to 8 to 10% on unescorted deep penetration raids in early 1943. American industrial capacity could sustain 1.8% losses indefinitely. German industrial capacity couldn't sustain the bombing those missions delivered. Historians calculate that long-range escort fighters, primarily the P-51 Mustang, advanced the Allied victory timeline by 6 to 9 months by enabling sustained daylight bombing of German war production. 6 months in 1944 represented hundreds of thousands of lives. Wars are won by the side that solves problems fastest. The challenge facing American strategic bombing in 1943 wasn't complex. Bombers couldn't survive without escorts, and escorts couldn't reach the targets. The solution required recognizing that an existing airframe, initially dismissed by the U.S. Army Air Forces as unsuitable, could be transformed by installing a different engine. It required American industry to tool up production of a British engine under license. It required operational commanders to abandon doctrine stating that bombers could defend themselves. Every step contradicted institutional momentum. American aviation culture preferred radial engines over inline Merlins. Doctrine insisted formations provided mutual defense. Pride resisted adopting British solutions to American problems. The genius wasn't in the technology. It was in the willingness to abandon assumptions when evidence demanded it. Oberst Hoffmann's mistake wasn't tactical. He positioned his forces correctly based on the intelligence available. His error was strategic. He assumed yesterday's limitations would constrain tomorrow's enemy. The Americans who couldn't reach Germany in April suddenly could in May. The gap between those two realities lasted exactly long enough to be fatal. One navigation error by a German pilot delivered an FW-190 to the British in 1942. One brilliant engine swap transformed an average fighter into the war's most important. One willingness to abandon failing doctrine saved the strategic bombing campaign. In the end, the Americans didn't defeat German fighters with superior pilots or better tactics. They defeated them with superior range and superior adaptability. Sometimes distance matters more than firepower, and sometimes the willingness to change matters most of all. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, tracking down the after-action reports from the 4th Fighter Group and German intelligence assessments that completely missed the Mustang's arrival, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more turning points from the air war over Europe that deserve to be remembered. The intelligence failures, the technological breakthroughs, the tactical adaptations that changed entire campaigns. I'll be bringing you a new story every week. What should I cover next? The capture of the F-190, the development of deflection shooting doctrine, or the P-38's troubled service in Europe? Let me know in the comments below.